Now, what happens when cortisol and adrenaline, aldosterone, and noradrenaline are produced? Well, first of all, our brain, as I say, get excited for some reason. So the hypothalamus will send a signal either to the spinal cord or the pituitary gland. It will go to that message. It will go to the adrenal glands, either the medulla or the cortex, and these hormones are produced. So what happened to our body? If we're producing noradrenaline and adrenaline, as I say, we have a rise of the blood pressure. The heartbeat is faster. We have an increase of oxygen in our bloodstream. We have an increase of attention because of that. And on the other side, if we have in a rise of cortisol and aldosterone, we have a rise of glucose in the blood. And that is due to the fact that cortisol go to target specifically muscles and liver, which they have in some kind of sugar in a deposit, which is called glycogen. And they remove this sugar in deposit, in making it in form of glucose straight away for in the bloodstream, straight away available specifically for the brain, because it's a very high energetic kind of fire up. And they put a lot of fat in the bloodstream, and that's the reason why high level of cortisol can generate all sort of problem with lipids in the bloodstream. And those lipids, they're supposed to be used by your muscles to produce energy. And we've seen then there is a higher level of blood sugar. As I said, there is high blood pressure again. We've seen a lot more blood volume, because modulating the salts in our bloodstream, sodium and potassium, we are taking more water out, so there is less water going into the urines to increase the blood volume, so we can oxygenate, we can bring those hormones around, we can bring that sugar around, and we can make sure that we have an adequate response to that specific stressor. Now, all this is fabulous if it's just that car that passed close to us, or we encounter a lion, or we need to run for some reason, we've been chased. But if there is not a physical response, then it's different, because that sugar is going to stay there. It's going to be used some from our brain, but mostly it's going to keep circulating on the bloodstream. Also, cortisol, it should have a negative effect, like a sort of negative feedback to our brain to stop producing itself, basically. And if we are not having that negative effect, that blood sugar is going to stay there. And what happens when the cortisol is no balance anymore, when there is too much adrenaline and noradrenaline in our body? Well, we're starting to develop some specific problem. The brain, first of all, is one of the most affected organs from the stress. Why? Because the cortisol actually have an effect on changing the size of our brain and changing the structure of our brain. It specifically work on the brain by stopping the connection between the different cells. So it will make us to think in a very slow way, in a way. And also, it will stop our brain repairing patterns. There is an area of our brain, then it has specific cells, then they are not totally developed, and they are used to repair your brain on a regular basis. It's called Hippocampus. And cortisol is able to inhibit the release of these new cells. So long, prolonged stress, it will reduce the connection between the brain cells. It will reduce the repairing of the brain, and that it can generate problems like, example, diminishing on learning or diminishing on memory, confusion. Also, because of the high blood pressure, the brain might start to feel overloaded, and we're starting to have headache. Also, because of this connection not being perfect, we might starting to have mood swings, example, burst of anger or depression, or simply sadness, not even depression. We will starting to have, example, anxiety or even panic attacks, because remember, the adrenaline and the noradrenaline increasing the amount of oxygen, so we inhale more and we're starting to feel dizzy, and all that dizziness, it might create like we are very sick, and that's classical form of panic attack. We hyperventilated. So our brain is the most affected, but there is a good news. Now, we know the long-term exposure to cortisol might have all these problems and can actually have an effect on something called epigenetics. So it means if we are affected, we can send the same affected disorder to our child and so and so. But because we can reprogram our brain in a way, we can erase those problems too. So if we act properly, if we cope better with the stress, we are able to correct some of those damages, and we are not sending it over to our next generation. Regarding the heart is another part of the body, then it gets really upset by the stress, because as we say, we have more blood volume, we had more blood pressure, the heartbeat get faster, so obviously we might get a little bit of tiredness. Also, cortisol, we know it might increase the level of cholesterol, example, and that it would be a trigger for, example, arteriosclerosis, so hardening of the veins if it deposit. So obviously that is not a good thing. For what to reserve the stomach, well, the noradrenaline and the adrenaline specifically work on slowing down the digestion, and then have an effect on the stomach, obviously, and on the rest of the guts. You might lose your appetite when you're very, very stressed, or you might overeat, and we'll see that is also affecting the brain. Then it's giving you the signal of having craving to produce more dopamine to try to compensate for the high cortisol, but also it's because of the sluggish digestion we might feel we need to replenish more often. You might get heartburn because there is a disbalance of, for example, magnesium, which is involved on the production of the acid on the stomach, and you must start to feel a little bit hyperacidity or heartburn in general. Stomach ache for the contraction because of cortisol level and the excess eating. You might starting to pile up a little bit more weight. And the reproductive system as well, specifically cortisol might generate estrogen dominance. That is because it's the same parts of our of the fat that we use to produce cortisol is the same one that we produce progesterone. So if we utilize too much of these lipids to produce cortisol, we produce less progesterone, and that is going to make our body have more estrogen in our bloodstream, which means irregular period. If you are in menopause, you might have more hot flushes. You might starting to produce a little bit more testosterone instead, and you will have a reduce of the sexual drive. So for the women, cortisol, it may actually have a big impact also on the hormonal balance, but also on the men. We've seen them people, then they have high level of cortisol, they have a low sperm count, and also because of the blood not being properly regulated with volume and with pressure, we're starting to see a desired change, but also impotence. Pancreas is involved, obviously, because it produces insulin, and insulin is that hormones that allowed, is like a sort of key that allow the glucose from the bloodstream to enter your cells in the body to feed them. But if we have a lot of cortisol and we have a lot of more glucose on the bloodstream, the pancreas might be put under stress because it has to produce a lot of insulin. Also, the cells might not respond anymore to insulin after a while. They become desensitized, and that is when you start to have an insulin resistance. So all these might generate diabetes, example, on a long term. on the worst scenario, as I said, these are the worst scenario. We can cope and we can stop this before. We just need to be aware of it. Regarding the intestine, again, slowing down the digestion, you might start to feel constipated, or you might starting to having diarrheas because that too much water that was on the bloodstream, it gets reversed on the blood, on the gut, and then you will have an evacuation which is a little bit more violent. Also, remember, adrenaline and noradrenaline can have that impact on releasing the white muscles, which is basically the guts and part of the bladder. High level of stress can increase level of infection. So you're seeing then cortisol will have an impact if it's quite high on the immune system. So it's making harder to recover. So example, if you are stressed because you got sick, you will notice your time frame of healing, it's much longer. Why? Because you utilize all those minerals, all those nutrients to feed your cortisol and not to feed the organ that is affected. It can be your lungs, it can be your stomach, it can be your skin. And also, by not reacting properly, you will notice there is an increase of a production of osteoclasts in your body, in your bones, sorry. And those osteoclasts, they are cells, and they are specifically working on redigest the bones to make new bone coming through. But if you have a high level of cortisol, that action is too high. And that is the reason, example, that if you have a high level of cortisol, you are more at risk of, example, osteopenia, which is the softening of the bones, or you are more at risk of osteoporosis, because you are not able to have those cells and they absorb the calcium and strengthen up the bone texture.